to say the fourth and final thing. It's not enough if we get proximate. It's not enough that we change narratives. It's not enough if we stay home. The fourth thing we have to do is that we sometimes have to do uncomfortable things. I hate saying that because I know that human beings are programmed to do what's comfortable. We've got a lot of medical people in the room who understand the biology of choice and the psychology of choice, and I know we are programmed to seek what's comfortable. But I'm here to tell you that if we want to end this epidemic, if we want to change the world, if we want to create more justice, we are going to have to sometimes do uncomfortable things. I look at the history of the world and we've made great strides toward freedom and justice. We've made change in the world, and I can't see a narrative where people only did the things that were comfortable and convenient. Every time we've made progress, it's because someone has done something uncomfortable. And I think we have to do it. People get on the stage and they start insisting that we pay attention to the needs and challenges of the trans community. It's uncomfortable, but it's necessary. We have to do uncomfortable. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not here to speak against comfort. I'm not saying I'm all against comfort. I like comfort. I went to Mississippi to give a talk not too long ago, and I got off the plane. The people met me at the airport. They said, "Oh, Mr. Stevenson, we know all about you. We know what kind of person you are. We know what kind of work you do. And we're having our conference at the luxurious DoubleTree Hotel. And we decided that you wouldn't want to stay at the luxurious DoubleTree Hotel." They said, "We've asked one of the farmers to put you up at the bar." And I said, "What is wrong with you?" I said, "Of course I want to stay at the luxurious DoubleTree Hotel. I like those cookies just like everybody else." That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is that sometimes you have to choose to do uncomfortable things because it's the necessary thing. I've spent my career representing people on death row. And we've had some wonderful moments. We've had some success. We just got a man released who spent 30 years on death row for a crime he didn't commit. He walked home 4 months ago, and I've been happy every day. I talk to him every day. I talk to him, and it's empowering. But I will tell you that not every day has been like that. We've also had these moments that were so painful. Between 2009 and 2011, the highest execution rate in America was in the state of Alabama. It's 17 executions in a 30-month time period. Every other month, somebody was being executed. And what people don't know about our system is that there is no right to counsel, even for people on death row. After your trial and your appeal, we don't provide lawyers to people. And we have these people literally dying for legal assistance. And there is no public defender system in my state, and we couldn't get anybody to provide services. And so we committed to represent all the people with execution dates. We have this beautiful staff of young lawyers, and the lawyers are getting beat down by these men who were being executed. And I said, I've been doing this longer than the rest of y'all. Let me take the next one, and y'all take a break. And I got involved in the case of a man who was suffering from intellectual disability. And our courts have banned the execution of people with intellectual disability, but nonetheless, nobody had raised the issue. And one of the challenges in our system is that we tend to prioritize finality over fairness. And so I got involved and started arguing that this man can't be executed because he suffers from intellectual disability. He has mental retardation. You can't execute him. But each court said too late. The trial court said too late. The state appellate court said too late. The federal court said too late. And finally, it was the day of his execution. I was waiting for word from the U.S. Supreme Court, and I got this dreadful order from the court denying our stay motion, essentially saying, too late. It was an hour before the execution, and I picked up the phone to call this man to give him this terrible news. And when I gave him this news, you could just hear the heartbreak. And in addition to being intellectually disabled, this man had another challenge. When he got nervous, when he got anxious, when he got worried, he couldn't get his words out. He would begin to stutter really, really badly. He had this very severe speech impediment that would just get worse when he was anxious. And he told me he had something to say to me, but he couldn't get his words out. He was begging me not to get off the phone until he said what he had to say, but then he couldn't get his words out. And I was listening to this man trying to get the words out, straining so hard, struggling so hard to get his words out, but he couldn't. And the harder he tried, the more he was just ripping my heart apart. And I was standing there, and I could hear the guards in the background trying to make him move faster, which just made it worse. And they were saying, we've got to go, and he was trying, and he couldn't get his words out. And I was just devastated. Tears started running down my face. I remembered something I'd actually forgotten. I remembered how when I was about 9 years old, my mother had taken me to church one Sunday, and I was there with my brother, and we were talking with our friends, and there was a little skinny kid standing next to one of my friends. And this little boy wasn't saying anything, and at some point I asked him what his name was or where he was from, and I remembered that night how when I asked him that, this little boy couldn't get his words out. He also struggled with this speech impediment, this stutter. And because I'd never dealt with anybody with that particular challenge, I did something really ignorant. I laughed. And my mother was standing across the room and she saw me laughing at this little boy. And when she saw me laughing, she gave me this look I'd never seen before. And she came across the room and she grabbed me by the arm and she pulled me aside. She said, "Bryan, don't you ever laugh at somebody because they can't get their words out right. Don't you ever do that." I said, "I'm sorry, Mom, I didn't mean to." She said, No, you know better than that." And then my mother said to me, "Now you go back over there and tell that little boy you're sorry." I said, "Okay," and I took a step and my mother grabbed me by the arm. She said, "Wait a minute. After you tell that little boy you're sorry, I want you to hug that little boy." I rolled my eyes a little bit. I said, "Okay, Mom." I took a step and she grabbed me by the arm again. She said, "Wait." She said, "After you hug that little boy, I want you to tell that little boy you love him." I said, "Mom, I can't go over there." So she gave me that look again. So I said, okay. And I remember going over to this little boy and walking up to him and saying, "Look, man, I'm sorry." And then I sort of lunged at him and gave him my little boy version of a man hug. And what I remembered that night, the night of that execution, was how I said to that little boy as insincerely as I possibly could. I said, "I love you." And what I'd forgotten but remembered all of a sudden was how that little boy hugged me back and whispered flawlessly in my ear. He said, "I love you too." And I was thinking about that while this man was trying to get his words out, and the tears were just running down my face. And finally he said, "Mr. Stevenson, I just want you to know, I'm so grateful that you chose to represent me. I want to thank you for fighting for me." And then he said, "I love you for trying to save my life." Hung up the phone, took him away, put him on a gurney, and executed him. I hung up the phone, I thought to myself, I can't do this anymore. It's too hard, too hard, too hard, too hard, too hard. I kept thinking about how broken he was. And the question I had in my mind is, why in this country do we hate the broken? What is it about us that when we see brokenness, we want to crush it, we want to kill it, we want to throw it away. We don't want to have anything to do with anything that's broken. What is it about us that we respond that way? And then I realized that my life is filled with brokenness. All of my clients are broken people. They've been broken by racism, they've been broken by poverty, they've been broken by disease, they've been broken by disability, they've been broken by exclusion and marginalization, they've been broken by trauma, broken. I work in a broken system of justice. People too distant to actually know what it means to be compassionate, to do justice. They're too far away to actually see the humanity in front of them. A broken system. I said, I don't want to do this anymore. That's when I had to have that conversation you have to have with yourself when you're making these big decisions. I started thinking, well, why have you been doing this? And all of a sudden, I realized something I'd never realized before. That night, I realized that I don't do what I do because I've been trained to do it. I don't do what I do because somebody's got to do it. I don't do what I do because of mass incarceration and excessive punishment. I don't do what I do because it's important that someone do it. I don't do what I do because if I don't do it, nobody will. I don't do what I do because I get to talk to wonderful people like you. I realized something that night I'd never realized before. And what I realized is that I do what I do because I'm broken too. If you change narratives, if you stay hopeful, if you do uncomfortable things, it will break you. But there's a power in brokenness. When you're broken, you know something about compassion. When you're broken, you know something about grace. When you're broken, you know something about mercy. When you know something about the human spirit. And it's in brokenness that we actually will find the cure to this epidemic. I believe really simple things. I believe that each person is more than the worst thing they've ever done. I believe if somebody tells a lie, they're not just a liar. I think if somebody takes something that doesn't belong to them, they're not just a thief. I believe even if you kill somebody, you're not just a killer. People with HIV are not just people with HIV. We've got to understand that we are more than our worst decisions. The second thing I believe is I don't believe that I don't believe the opposite of poverty in this country is wealth. We talk too much about money in America. We do. I don't believe that the opposite of poverty is wealth. I believe that in this country, in most of the communities that we are working, I don't believe the opposite of poverty is wealth. I believe the opposite of poverty is justice. And when we commit ourselves to just treatment for all people, just care, just systems, that's when we get to a place. And third and finally, I don't think we can judge how we do in this country by looking at how we treat the powerful and the rich and the privileged. I think we have to judge how we're doing in this country by looking at how we treat the poor and the incarcerated and the diseased. Finally, this nation, for all of us, can't be evaluated by how we're dealing with people who are not struggling with the issues that we are struggling with. I look at our health system, and we have a healthcare system that frequently cares better for people who are rich and well than poor and sick. And because of that, we haven't done what we have to do. So I'm persuaded that if we choose to get proximate, if we change this narrative, if we stay hopeful and we do some uncomfortable things, we can change the world. We can end this epidemic. And I'll end with this. There's a different metric system for those of you who are doing this. For those of you who are staying proximate, who are using your hope, who are changing narratives, who are doing uncomfortable things, let me just end by saying this to you. Don't judge how you're doing by how much money you make, by how many people know your name, by how many people applaud you. There's a different metric system for you. I learned it from an old man. I was giving a talk in a church, and this old man came into the church, and he was sitting in a wheelchair in the back of the church. And he was looking at me with this really harsh, almost angry look on his face. And I kept giving my talk, but he was staring at me so hard, I was getting worried that something was going to happen. He was just staring at me. And I got through the talk, and everybody was nice. They came up, and they shook my hand. They were very appropriate, but the man was still sitting in the back staring at me. And finally, when everybody else left, he got a little boy, this man in the back, to wheel him down to me. He came wheeling down the middle aisle of that church, and he got in front of me. When he got in front of me, he had that very stern, angry look on his face. He put his hand up, and he said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And I just stood there and looked at him. And he asked me again, he said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And I stepped back and I started mumbling something to myself. And he said one last time, he said, "Do you know what you're doing?" And then he said, "I'm going to tell you what you're doing." And this older man looked at me, he says, "You're beating the drum for justice." He said, "You keep beating the drum for justice." And I will tell you, I was so moved. I was so moved. I was also really relieved. And then he said, "Come here, come here, come here." And he grabbed me by my jacket. He pulled me into his wheelchair. He said, "I'm going to show you something." And this older man turned his head. He said, "You see this cut I have behind my right ear?" He said, "I got that cut in Greene County, Alabama, 1963, trying to register people to vote." He said, "You see the scar I have down here in the bottom of my neck?" He said, "I got that scar in Philadelphia, Mississippi, 1964, trying to register people to vote." He turned his head, he said, "You see this dark spot?" He said, "That's my bruise. I got my bruise in Birmingham, Alabama, 1965, trying to register people to vote." So I'm going to tell you something, young man. He said, "People look at me. They think I'm some old man sitting in a wheelchair covered with cuts and bruises and scars." He said, "But I'm going to tell you something." He said, "These aren't my cuts. These aren't my bruises. These aren't my scars." He said, "These are my medals of honor." Do critically important things to help those who are disfavored, those who have been excluded, those who have been marginalized, those who have been forgotten, that sometimes feel like they're injuries, that feel like they're cuts and bruises and scars. But you honor this movement. You honor social justice. You honor our claim to be part of a better place, a more just place when you do that. And I just want to celebrate you for taking up that cause, for getting proximate, for staying hopeful, for changing narratives, and yes, for doing uncomfortable things. God bless all of us.